Fantasy drafts coming up in the next few weeks. Here's a few wide receivers I would look to avoid, and this is going off of ADP. And just I'm thinking some of these guys are going to regress this season. The first wide receiver, Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. I know Davante Adams last season, overall the numbers were great, but there were times where he didn't do much, and a couple big games got him to his numbers. So right now he's going Davante Adams in that mid-second round in most fantasy drafts. Last season, 103 receptions, 1,144 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns on a whopping 175 targets for this Vegas Raider team. Now Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell is going to be the quarterback, depending who wins that training camp battle between those two quarterbacks. And I know last season, Adams, he played the majority of the year with O'Connell at quarterback after Jimmy Garoppolo went down and was out for the season. Adams, he's up there at 32 years old, and we know some of these receivers start breaking down 30, 32 range, even though there's a possibility Adams could get traded as well to a contending team like the New York Jets or another team as the season goes on. But right now, some wide receivers going after Davante Adams that I'd rather have in most drafts. Chris Olave, Drake London, Deebo Samuel, Nico Collins, guys like that, I think could be better options than Davante Adams. I'm not saying Adams is going to have a horrible year, but in terms of ADP, and like I said, turning 32 years old, I don't believe he's going to keep putting up these monster years year after year, especially in the situations he's in. So right now, like I mentioned, some of those receivers I'd rather have on my roster than the Davante Adams. And this season, I'm going to look to avoid him in that early range. If he drops to that late third, early fourth round range, then you pick him up. But in that early to mid second round range, I think it's a steep price for Adams this season. Next receiver, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans. So DeAndre Hopkins, once again, another injury coming into the season. He won't need surgery, but he's going to be out several weeks. And even if he's ready, let's say, for the first game of the year, Hopkins isn't going to be 100%. He's another receiver in his 30s like Davante Adams. And last year, some good games and some games where Hopkins in PPR week didn't even get double-digit fantasy points, 75 catches, 1,057 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns. And I like the targets at 137 targets. But this offseason, Tennessee brought in some reinforcements. You got Calvin Ridley to a monster contract. They signed him to. I think he has a good season. Signed Tyler Boyd, another solid slot, and a third receiver coming in for this Tennessee Titans team. And you still got Traylon Burks, and out of the backfield, Tony Pollard, who's a pretty decent receiver. And Tajay Spears is a 50-50 split, most likely, in that backfield. So with all those factors, and now Hopkins down with the injury, he's just a wide receiver I'm going to avoid going into draft day. I know he's going that 7th, 8th round range as well, like a Rashee Rice. But like I said, Hopkins, he's up there in age now. Calvin Ridley, he might take over as the number one. I know it's definitely in a quarterback upgrade going into this year than last year, where Hopkins had a couple good games, Levis, towards the end of the season. But I will avoid Hopkins in drafts this year. Next receiver, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. New coaching staff, new offensive coordinator for DK Metcalf. And he's another wide receiver that a lot of people, they overrate him, I believe. We thought he was going to be a monster breakout receiver and a top 10 option every season, but the last couple of years, he's finishing that 20 to 22 points per game range at the wide receiver position. And like I said, the numbers at the end of the year look solid, but a lot of games where he disappears is DK Metcalf, and he don't do much. And right now, he's going, I've seen him as early as the late second round to mid-third round in fantasy drafts is DK Metcalf. Last season, 66 catches, 1,114 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. 19 targets. Definitely solid numbers, no doubt about it, for Metcalf. In a lot of receivers I'd rather have than DK Metcalf going after him, like a Jalen Waddle, I'd rather have a DJ Moore, even a Cooper Kupp, I believe I'd rather have Michael Pittman. Those are receivers he's going ahead of right now in some fantasy drafts is DK Metcalf. So Metcalf, once again this season, I think he falls anywhere from that 18 to 22 points per game range for a wide receiver. I'm not saying he's a horrible pick, but where his ADP is, and like some of the wide receivers I mentioned, I'd rather have those receivers than Metcalf going into fantasy drafts in a round or two later than where he's going right now in fantasy drafts. And the reason to avoid him is because of his ADP. Next receiver, I look to avoid Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. Amari Cooper, last few seasons, ever since getting traded out of Dallas, even with backup quarterbacks, like last season with Joe Flacco, Thompson Robinson, he played pretty good football with Amari Cooper, finishing the year 72 catches, 1,250 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. But the only problem, Cooper and Deshaun Watson really haven't played together over the last few seasons. Since Watson, he's been there. He was suspended half the season. Then last year, he was injured more than half the season as well, and not really looking like his old self was Deshaun Watson. So Amari Cooper, he's been a great wide receiver over the last few years, but I just don't like his ADP as well, going in that mid-third, late-third round, where there's wide receivers on the board I'd rather have than Cooper this season. Jalen Waddle and Cooper are pretty close in the rankings. I'd rather go with Waddle. Malik Neighbors in that range as well. Even Zay Flowers, he has more upside than Amari Cooper. Like I said, Amari Cooper, he's at that 30-year-old age now at the wide receiver position, where we see the speed and some of these wideouts lose a step or two, even though Amari was never the fastest wide receiver, always a good route runner and knows how to clean his routes and stuff. But just like I mentioned, I believe these wide receivers were more upside and younger wide receivers were better quarterbacks as well, that I'd rather have Cooper. So if Cooper falls to that late 4th, early 5th round range, then I think it's good value. But getting them in that mid-third, late third with those other receivers on the board, I just wouldn't take them, and I would avoid them at that ADP going into drafts this season. And the 5th and final wide receiver I look to avoid in drafts, Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Christian Kirk, the last few seasons, he's found a home, no doubt about it, in Jacksonville after getting a nice contract a few years ago. But the thing with Christian Kirk is they're going to play him more in the slot, and he's not going to be a starter out there at all times. We saw it already in the preseason game. Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr., 2 wideouts they brought in this offseason. Gabe Davis getting a nice contract, and Thomas, an early round draft pick for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And those are big targets and guys who really can make big plays down the field. Christian Kirk is as well, but last season when we saw Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones and Kirk all healthy at the same time, it was more the same thing as well, where Kirk was more phased out of the offense and not running as many routes and obviously not seeing the field as much as he would as a starter. So after that first preseason game and seeing Davis and Thomas play more snaps and being out there more, I know they need more reps with Trevor Lawrence, where Kirk's played with him for a few seasons now. But I still believe Christian Kirk going in that late 5th, 6th round range is overpriced right now with most platforms. And I'd rather have players in that range. Like a Terry McLaurin is around that range with a Christian Kirk. Zay Flowers is in that ballpark as well. Keenan Allen, just to name a few guys. Even Rome Odunze as well has more upside, I believe, than Christian Kirk. I know Kirk last year put up good numbers, but like I said, with injuries to Ridley on and off, and Zay Jones missed a lot of time. That's why he got a chance with the 57 catches, 787 receiving yards. I don't like his ADP at all, is Christian Kirk, and I believe he's more of a player that to come off your bench in that 8th to 10th round range, but paying that mid-5th to early 6th round price, I don't like it for Kirk, and he's a receiver I look to avoid this season. So that's a few wide receivers I look to avoid entering fantasy drafts within the next few weeks.